Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Excuse me, still having tons and tons of problems with my voice. It's still getting a little bit sore after I speak. It's absolutely worn out even after I make my morning musing filming. It's kind of wasted for the rest of the day. It's crazy. So anyway, welcome back. Doing the very best that I can. Maybe just a tiny, tiny bit of incremental improvement from week to week, but it's still awfully slow. So I hope you did some study on the meaning of the Greek word apokatastasis in Acts chapter 3, verse 23, and the Greek word diorthosis in Hebrews chapter 9. Now, why is this important? It is important because Acts chapter 3, 23, it speaks of Christ whom the heavens must receive until the restoration of all things that are spoken by the prophets. All of the prophets who have ever spoken from the foundation of the world. So the coming of the Lord of Acts chapter 3, which is the return of the absent master. I mean, after all, Christ departed in Acts chapter 1, right? He left. He's the absent master. Do you suppose that Peter in Acts chapter 3 is speaking of a different coming of the Lord than that in Acts chapter 1? If so, where's the distinction? So, once again, let me reiterate, because this is so important. Acts chapter 3 is talking about the coming of the Lord, but it's talking about the coming of the Lord that was foretold by John the Baptizer, who initiated the restoration of all things. Matthew 17, 10 and following. So the work of John the Baptizer was to begin the work of restoration and to prepare for the coming of the Lord. Well, if that is that coming of the Lord that is related to the restoration work of John, is that a different coming of the Lord from that in Acts chapter 3, verse 23? Once again, if it is, where's the distinction? But let's not forget that John's message of that coming day of the Lord, the great and the terrible day of the Lord, Peter applied to his generation, Acts chapter 2, verse 40. And let us not forget, John himself said, speaking of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, those who came out to be baptized of him, although they weren't particularly religious, sincere in their religiosity, John said, "Who warned you to flee from the wrath that is about to come?" Dale Ellison Jr. in his commentary on Matthew chapter 3, Donald Hagner and other commentators point out that John's language about the wrath that is about to come said that the emphasis on that judgment is to be found in the Greek word melo, which indicated that John was saying that judgment was about to come. It was imminent. And then, of course, John said the axe is already at the root. Judgment was about to fall. His winnowing fork, the instrument of judgment, of harvest, is already in his hand. We cannot deny the imminence of John's message. Well, once again, John, restore all things, he would begin the work, and he would prepare for the coming of the Lord. Isaiah chapter 40. He, as the voice, would prepare for the coming of the Lord in judgment and the kingdom. That's his message in Matthew chapter 3. And once again, it's the coming of the Lord of Acts chapter 3. So the role of John the Baptizer is extremely critical. I discuss it at length in my book, Elijah Has Come, because John was Elijah. Point number 2, to reiterate, this coming of the Lord of Acts chapter 3, it would be in fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. All of the prophets who have ever spoken. That means that the coming of the Lord of Acts chapter 3 would not be at the end of the New Covenant age in fulfillment of distinctive, disparate New Covenant promises unrelated to the Old. No, no, no. The coming of the absent master would be in fulfillment of those prophecies. So unless you can find a coming of the Lord that is distinct from, different from the Old Testament prophecies of the coming of the Lord for the restoration of all things, then that means that Acts chapter 3 is not talking about a future coming of the Lord, but the coming of the Lord at the end of the Old Covenant age and fulfillment of the Old Covenant. And as I shared with you yesterday, this word restoration and the restoration of all things was foretold in the Old Testament prophets. That word apokatastasis was used to speak both of the literal fulfillment or the literal restoration of Israel, Judah specifically, from Babylonian captivity. Back to the land, back to the city, back to the temple. But it was also used of the Messianic kingdom, the coming of the Lord to establish His kingdom in righteousness, to establish the kingdom in judgment. And then I took you to Hebrews chapter 9. Now remember, Acts chapter 3, coming of the Lord in the fulfillment of the Old Testament. We'll just keep it simple like that. Hebrews chapter 9. Christ would come the second time, His second appearing, would be in fulfillment of the Old Covenant. Let's see, how does the writer express it again? Of the system that stood in gifts, sacrifices, which were offered, but could not make the worshiper perfect. But they was concerned with foods and drinks, various washings, and carnal ordinances imposed until the time of Reformation. So the old law, and by the way, all of these feast days, which is exactly what it's talking about here, these divers washings, see, before they could go into Jerusalem and celebrate the feast days, they had to immerse themselves in one of the mikveh pools that were outside the city and that were dispersed throughout the city. Absolutely essential. You could not celebrate the feast days. So all of these references here, foods and drinks, well, every feast day was a celebration of food and drink. Various washings and fleshly ordinances, all of those had to do, ladies and gentlemen, with feast days. It's just another way of saying, like Paul did, let him judge you in respect of new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, which are, when he wrote in 62 AD, present, active, indicative, are a shadow of the good things that are about to come. So just like Hebrews chapter 10 speaks of those feast days, those carnal washings and ordinances, and he says that the law having a shadow of the good things about to come. See, Colossians 2:16 and 17, Hebrews chapter 9 and 10 are exactly parallel. And they're both in the present active indicative to speak of the feast days and all of the praxis surrounding that. And the writer says, Colossians chapter 2, they were shadows of the good things that were about to come. And in Hebrews 9, they would stand imposed legally, morally, mandatory until the time of Reformation. Now, here's something very, very quick, and this will have to be brief. Now, I have an extended discussion of the linguistics of Acts 3 and Hebrews 9 in my book, Like Father, Like Son, on Clouds of Glory. I have documentation from the lexicons, from the critical scholars, from Josephus, and from the Bible. The word apokatastasis was used in medical and political terms to set right, to set straight, to bring back to its proper condition and position that which had been, for instance, in medical terms, in some medical texts outside the Bible, a broken bone that had been broken, and the apokatastasis was you set the bone. In political terms, you have some situation that had gone wrong, and you have a restoration of the proper order. The same identical significance is given to diorthosis. All of the lexicons agree, ladies and gentlemen. Apokatastasis and diorthosis are synonyms. Please catch the power of this. The diorthosis, the restoration, the time of reformation would be at the end of the Old Covenant, because the writer says, the Holy Spirit is indicating this, the way into the holiest of all is not yet made manifest, while the first tabernacle is still standing, still has standing. It is symbolic for the present time in which gifts and sacrifices were offered every Sabbath and every feast day. Both gifts and sacrifices which are offered, which cannot make him who performed the services perfect in regarding to the conscience, concerned only with foods and drinks, various washings, and fleshly ordinances, imposed, that's binding, having validity, until the time of Reformation. So the law of Moses would remain imposed, valid, binding, until the time of Reformation. The time of Reformation is the time of setting things right, putting things back like they're supposed to be. But the Reformation would be at the end of the Old Covenant law. Oh, but wait. That's the time of Reformation, when all of those feast days and what they predicted, which were symbolic, they're prophetic. Oh, by the way, that word is technically parabolic. The feast days were the last great parables of Jesus. So those feast days pointed to, they played out, they pictorialized what was about to come. When would it come? At the time of Reformation. So when what the Old Testament feast days foreshadowed, prophesied, came to a reality, and what did those Old Testament feast days foreshadow? Oh, Rosh Hashanah, Day of Judgment. Yom Kippur, the coming of the Lord. Sukkot, the resurrection. The feast days would stand valid until that which they foreshadowed came to a reality. And now watch this. Reformation, putting things right, when Israel's feast days were fulfilled. Acts chapter 3, the restoration, the putting things right, would be when that which was spoken of by all of the Old Testament prophets came to fulfillment. Both passages speak of the fulfillment of the Old Testament promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Both passages affirm the continuing validity of those Old Testament promises and prophecies and practices until, number one, the apokatastasis, until the restoration, and number two, until The Reformation. Now, since the Reformation would be at the end of the Old Covenant law and practices, that means the apokatastasis, the coming of the Lord, the coming of the absent master. Of Acts 1, 1 Corinthians 15, Thessalonians, Revelation 19, all of those passages dealing with the return of the absent master are focused on the end of the Old Covenant world of Israel and the fulfillment of all of those practices and prophecies. All of those practices which were prophecies. Listen, don't forget, take advantage of the July and August Preterist Pilgrim Weekend. Very, very special pricing on all books and material. 15% off of orders over $25 or more, plus free shipping. This is for U.S. orders only. I cannot make the offer for overseas or out-of-country orders. I apologize for that, but it's simply not financially tenable. Okay, thank you so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. Where'd my book go? Well, don't forget, tomorrow we will continue our review and refutation of the book by Mr. Kyle Pope, Thinking About AD 70, and we will be talking more about this issue of the passing of the law. Mr. Pope affirms that when Jeremiah promised the new covenant, that at the very moment he promised the new covenant, the Old Testament became obsolete and ready to pass away. Honestly, that's a horrible argument. But hey, we'll talk about it more on the flip side. See you there.